crude oil treating, we're primarily talking about water and everything else. Usually it's water, maybe some solids or something. So what do we want to do? We want to provide separation. So getting rid of that free water, breaking any emulsions that are in there, because if you have emulsions, typically it's not going to pass your BS&W spec. Separate, out so we can sell the oil and take the water phase and do something else with it, whether it's injection or reuse somewhere. And then, of course, getting rid of the solids as much as you need uh, to be able to pass muster and sell it. Sometimes we would be talking about stabilization if it's real light hydrocarbons, so that you basically aren't getting the two-phase flow in the pipeline. So you want to stabilize it so you're lowering that vapor pressure below atmospheric pressure. Okay, because you have problems if you've got a lot of this in crude. If you have a lot of the gas, like some of the light gas you've heard about when, people say, oh, the Bakken oil is so explosive, you got to be careful. It's, all the gases that come off of oil, they're hydrocarbon gases, so they're all explosive. It's just that that's a real light oil. And if the oil hasn't been stabilized well before it's put into the rail cars or however, and they crash, it's going to cause an explosion. I'm not sure stabilizing it better would make that any better. I'd say probably not crashing the train would make it better, but that's just me. And desalting, that is not something we typically worry about in the U.S. That's something that's usually, or at least out in the production world, that's usually done more downstream. Even after you go through the midstream pipelines and everything, it's usually done at the refinery. So that's not something we typically worry about in the U.S. There are some other areas that they might be concerned with that, but that's done in our refineries. They are set up for that. So typical standards for crude transport. I think this is good to know. This isn't an always, this is kind of a typical range. Your BS&W, some people just call it BNS, but you're talking about your basic sediments and water here. You have to be less than whatever that max is, and that's where your LACT units are set to be able to reroute your oil if it doesn't meet that spec. Typically it's water we're concerned with at that point, but sometimes if you have a little issue with your tank, they call it turning over, it kind of gets enough water or sediments or something, or a sediment layer, that it actually kind of inverts to a reverse emulsion, but I would say that doesn't happen very often, and that's with heavier crudes. So this is a very typical range for BS&W. H2S, that kind of depends on who or where you're selling to. Most refineries are set up pretty well because we're not really doing much to the H2S primarily resides in the gas, of course, because it's lighter, and most of that you're taking out and then maybe addressing if you have gas treatment or selling or whatever you're doing with it. But typically you're not worrying about it because your oil usually doesn't have a super high rate or super high range. Crude oil, so sometimes we worry, especially with those lighter oils, that stabilizing to a certain Reid vapor pressure. I'm sure a lot of you did those kinds of Reid vapor pressure experiments in college, in your lab, just so that it's lower than what atmospheric is, although, it might, some parts of Montana and other areas, probably Colorado, are a little bit higher than 12 or lower than 12 psi in their atmosphere, but anyway, typically you're fine, okay, with that.